Welcome to ACR On Air, the official podcast of the American College of Rheumatology, where we have engaging conversations with leading rheumatology professionals on topics such as the latest research on rheumatic diseases, solutions for addressing practice management issues, legislative policies impacting patient care, and more. Here's your host.
Welcome back to another episode of ACR On Air, the official podcast of the American College of Rheumatology. I am your host, Dr. John Hausman. Show notes for this episode can be found at acronair.org. You can also find previous episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcast, Stitcher Radio, and on your favorite podcasting app. Today, we're talking about implicit bias, what it is, how it permeates our lives, and how it can negatively impact our workforce and patient care. To discuss this topic, we've invited Dr. Arin Reeves. Dr. Reeves is a leading researcher, author, and advisor in the fields of leadership and inclusion. She studied business at DePaul University's College of Commerce, attended law school at the University of Southern California, and received her PhD in sociology from Northwestern University. She practiced law for several years and served as an adjunct professor at Northwestern University. She's now the founder and managing director of a research and advisory firm. She's a best-selling author of 4 books, most recently one entitled In Charge. This book probably has the best subtitle I've ever heard. It's called In Charge, The Energy Management Guide for Badass Women Who Are Tired of Being Tired. Dr. Reeves has designed and led several comprehensive research projects on leadership and inclusion and topics related to diversity, inclusion, and equity. In today's episode, we discuss implicit and explicit bias, its role in hiring within the healthcare field, how it can affect our patient care in the clinic, and its impact on clinical research and on determining who we enroll for our research studies. Most importantly, we discuss what we can do about our implicit biases to prevent them from damaging our workforce and our patient care. Hope you enjoy the show. Arin, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let's start with the elephant in the room. What the heck is implicit bias, and how does it play a role in healthcare?
So implicit bias, I think, has gotten a bad rap, right? And there's a lot of bias about what bias is.
Okay.
Which is an interesting way to think about it. There's a lot written about bias that's actually quite inaccurate. So I love starting here because I think it's important to say, what is it? There are things that as humans we're born knowing how to do, right? These are instincts. These are like babies know to cry when they're upset. There's just certain things that are instincts. And we don't have to think about it. As we live our lives, there's things that we do consciously that then after enough repetition or exposure become unconscious. So that's not exactly instinct. It's not exactly something that we were born knowing how to do. But depending on what we're exposed to in our lives, depending on what we repeat over and over again, we create these shortcuts in our brains, right? So biases are literally just those shortcuts. So the reason that it gets attached to how we treat other humans, how we think about differences, is that based on what we're exposed to, we develop unconscious associations between things, right? So we might, for example, if you looked at a spider, right, the words that would immediately come to mind, unless you just really loved spiders, is
scary.
Exactly. Scary.
Run away.
Right. Creepy. A web might come to mind, etc. Those are unconscious associations because of how you've seen spiders your whole life. If you see a flower, pretty, spring, summer, those words would unconsciously come to mind. That makes total sense. And in most situations, those unconscious associations serve us really well. But with people, we also develop unconscious assumptions, like the one that we deal with a lot is women, for example, as really good parents, as good mothers, as nurturing, and men not so much, right? Or we might see men as strong, but women as emotional. All these things are over the course of our lives. What television we watched, like where we worshiped, what our families told us, what media we're used to. All of that creates these unconscious associations. These associations lead us to act before we realize we're making conscious decisions. And so we might be more likely to hire a man over a woman. We might be more likely, I guess in sort of the things that have been in our society, law enforcement might be more likely to see a young Black man as dangerous over a young white man. So somebody doing the exact same actions, those unconscious associations are going to lead to behavior before we realize we're thinking about it and choosing the behavior. And that is where the deep level of conversation around diversity and inclusion and equity has really sort of come to be with the connection with that word.
Implicit bias is what you mentioned, these sort of unconscious thoughts, frameworks that we've developed over years, whether it's at home, at school, in the workplace, in the media, about other people, these sort of shortcuts that we take about who's good, who's bad, who's effective, who's strong, who's weak. Okay. And so the differences between, can you explain a little bit more the differences about explicit bias versus implicit bias?
Sure. Implicit is humans have intention action gap, right? There's a lot of stuff we intend to do at the end of the day. Like you haven't done it. Just New Year's resolutions are a great example of all the stuff we commit to, and then we fall back into our previous behavior. So implicit is when you are intending to be inclusive, when you are committed to being inclusive, but you don't realize that you're making decisions that are based on that, right? So for example, University of Chicago did a study where the study's been popularized quite a bit, where they sent out resumes with different names, right? So the name Jamal versus the name Jason. And the HR people who got these resumes were far more likely, exact same, literally everything exactly the same except for the name, more likely to call the white sounding, right? The white sounding name in versus the Black sounding name. These are not people who sat there and said, I don't want to hire Black people, or I don't want to hire women. Explicit is hate crimes, right? Like that's the extreme that we see when you've got, unfortunately, we've seen quite a rise in explicit bias. So when you see a young man in New York who says, I'm going to go to Buffalo to shoot Black people, right? Because I want to kill them. And because of what they're doing, that's explicit. The whole train of thought is explicit. Now, there's a lot of research in neurobehavioral sociology of, did it start off implicit? Did it become explicit? Gosh, right? Like understanding the brain of when explicit transitions to implicit, when implicit transitions to explicit. There's obviously not clear lines. There's a lot of gray areas, but if you think about that HR study versus what happened in Buffalo, you kind of can see at least the polarities of implicit and explicit.
That's so interesting. And it sounds like from what you're describing that implicit bias seems to be much more difficult to recognize, right? Because it's people saying, I'm not biased, I'm not racist, I want diversity and inclusion in my hospitals, and yet at the end of the day, you hire white men rather than a Black woman for the same role.
Exactly. And the thing with explicit bias is we deal with explicit bias through compliance, right? Like hospitals have rules that say you can't discriminate based on gender. So you can't have applicants that are male and female and say, I don't want to hire the women. Explicit, we actually deal with through laws and policies and regulations and protocols and all of that. Implicit, we need people to interrupt their own behaviors, right? Or we need social and cultural cues that interrupt behavior. And that gets to be a lot harder. I'll give you an example where it can be something that's just innocent and personal and how it could look in a more dangerous zone, right? So I have really eclectic taste in music, as does my son. And there was A few months ago, I was listening to this song, beautiful country song. Like I just was so peaceful. It just was very soulful and I loved it. I was listening to it over and over again. And one day my son walks in, he's a 17-year-old boy, walks in and says, Mom, like, I didn't know you liked him. He has a virtual concert coming up. Do you want to watch it with me? And I looked at my son, who's 6'4", right? Black boy. And I was like, yeah, I don't think we're talking about the same person. He's like, no, Mom. Like, this is, so he showed me a picture of the man who sang the song that I've been listening to that was very soulful. Young Black man in torn jeans, leaning against an urban building that had graffiti on it. And I was like, this is not the guy that sang this song that I have been listening to that has been making me feel better for like months. Because this looks like my son, right? I was like, I don't want to associate peace with my son. And he was like, no, Ma, this is him. And he played more of his music. And there was this moment in my mind where I was like, oh my God, like that's not who I had in my mind. Who did I have in my mind? I couldn't really tell you, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't that, right?
That is so interesting.
I pictured, I don't know, a less scraggly looking Willie Nelson type somewhere, like who had lived a lot of life and like really understood these words that he was saying, not like this young man. So in that situation, it's like, okay, not a big deal, but clearly my brain had associations that did that. But let's say I was a music producer, right? And my focus was in country music. Who am I more likely to listen to with the seriousness of saying, this is somebody that could be successful in country music? Like if I saw this young man's name is Kane Brown. If I saw Kane Brown's picture, I might immediately say, oh no, that's not a country music artist, right? So we all have these implicit associations. Sometimes they're just annoyances in our lives because they take us in directions we don't want. If we're in positions where we make decisions about other people, if we're judges, we're hiring people. And as practicing physicians, you're making, you don't realize it, but you're making a decision about whether somebody's really in pain, whether they can be trusted, how much pain they're in, whether physicians have implicit associations about who will follow their directions, who won't follow their directions, who should be blamed for their own like maladies, right? And who shouldn't. And so when you are in a position to make decisions or influence or impact other people's lives, that's where the bias ends up in inequities and disparities and these other things. But they can be just as innocent as me listening to a country music song, thinking I was listening to somebody who had lived their life as opposed to somebody who hadn't. And we have those little like moments of that's not what I thought it would look like, or that is, ooh, that's not how I expected this house to look. I mean, we have those all day, every day, where reality conflicts with those associations that we have.
That's so interesting. So in terms of sort of in specific with healthcare, you mentioned a few ways in which implicit bias may be playing a role. The first one is from a sort of hospital perspective about who you want to hire and whether the chief of the division would rather pick a white man rather than a Latinx woman, just because they're used to. The walls of our hospitals are lined by pictures of old white men who were the sort of proteges of medicine. And therefore, chiefs and people responsible for hiring, they assume hiring old white men is the right way to go. I think you call this, would this be an example of what you call a status quo bias?
It is a status quo bias. There's also other cognitive anchors in there too, right? So for example, when we look at the medical profession as a whole, there's actually different biases that attach to different components of the medical profession. So if you're talking about somebody who's a pediatrician, then it's not just the status quo bias of who's in medicine, but it's those characteristics that we attach to somebody being a good pediatrician, somebody who's nurturing, somebody who's good with kids. And so we're more likely to see women as being successful as pediatricians. We're more likely to see women as being successful as family practitioners, for example. But then let's say you talk about like orthopedic surgery. And suddenly like it's not, we no longer care if orthopedic surgeons are nurturing, right? We're now suddenly into things where we're thinking in terms of skill, and we're thinking in terms of sharpness, and we're thinking in terms of people who understand like physical movement and physical activity. And so if you just think about even within the medical profession, where do we see women, right? And where do we see more men? And even though the medical profession has a lot of diversity in it, especially like international, like foreign medical students, for example,
Yep.
you still see people more likely to not go into certain areas versus other areas, right? And so you're less likely to see a female head of radiology, and you're more likely to see a female head of internal medicine or pediatrics. So some of it is status quo. What have we historically seen? But some of it is medicine is very, very just as every profession is. And all of those other things too that come into play in terms of who's nurturing, who's better with kids, who's better with older people, etc. That then also plays a role in med school. It plays a role in residencies. It plays a role in fellowships, right? So by the time you've got a hospital administrator making a decision about who to hire, like say at the attending level, you've got a lot of places throughout the process where bias has played a role, where is somebody who's looking for a new radiologist can say, well, there's not a lot of female radiologists. And that's actually true. But you go back one step, you go back two steps, and you say, what role did bias play in why the pool looks the way it does?
That's fascinating.
And sometimes hospitals will publish their physician demographics, and it doesn't look bad on the surface, but I always ask, like, break it down by specialty, and then suddenly you see clusters.
That is so interesting. Yeah, at least in rheumatology, I think we have a pretty good gender diversity, or I think it's actually a little bit more skewed towards women rather than men. But in terms of ethnic and racial diversity, I think that's where there's a big gap. I know that Black rheumatologists and Latinx rheumatologists, certainly the numbers aren't representative of the population as a whole. So there's huge improvements to be made there. But I guess my question is, why is it important to have a diverse workforce? Is it just because we want a diverse workforce, or are there added benefits from having people of different backgrounds and different ethnicities and different genders in the workforce?
There's a couple of different ways to look at it, right? When people say, do we want a diverse workforce? I ask the question a different way. It's, why don't we have a representative workforce? I'm a lawyer by trade, also done, I mean, obviously I've done doctoral work in this, but as a lawyer, the way you ask the question is very important because it sets people onto particular thought patterns. So if I say, why don't doctors look like their patients? Right? That's a different question than would a diverse medical profession help with healthcare disparities? Those are two completely different questions. So I tend to think of it less as, do we need more diversity in the healthcare profession, and more, why don't doctors look like patients? And so that question leads us to things like structural inequities, right? Like access to college, access to medical school, cost of medical school, all of that. Those are different problems for us to fix, because whenever a profession isn't representative of the population, there's something else going on that we need to fix.
Yeah.
Now, if you ask the question of, do diverse perspectives create better health outcomes for people? The answer is absolutely yes. Right? And there've been some very, very, very specific things in medicine. Like, for example, how for a very long time, women's symptoms that women expressed when they were having heart attacks were oftentimes determined to be hysteria. And they were given antidepressants and sent home.
Oh, my goodness.
Right. And so it's always interesting to me, like, women are technically 51% of the world's population, we still have, if you look at the majority of research that's been done on things like heart disease, on things like lung cancer, majority of the populations have been men. And we don't know how things affect, I mean, like biologically, we can talk about environmental differentials in different races, but there's just some straight differences between male and female bodies. And
Yeah.
when you haven't included enough women, just one thing that was really interesting that happened recently is, everybody in my family was vaccinated. I got my daughter vaccinated, my son vaccinated, my daughter's 18. And she goes, Mom, I think I got a COVID period. And I was like, what the hell is a COVID period? And she's like, Mom, it's all over like TikTok and Instagram. She's like, a lot of my girlfriends who've had vaccinations got a breakthrough period in the middle of their cycle.
Huh.
And I was like, what? So I started asking some of my older female friends, and they were like, yeah, that happened to me too. And I started doing research on it. And it turns out that in Israel, where the population studied who were vaccinated were in fact more women than men, they did find that, and they were telling patients about that. In the United States, most of the populations that have been studied have been so male that the breakthrough periods that sometimes women were having were written off as like just aberrations, not like actual potential side effects that people should be careful of. If you don't have people whose experiences are different, you are making medical decisions, treatment decisions, diagnostic decisions based on a very limited point of view. And that does not seem logical. When you think about diverse perspectives, it's not that we just want different people to be part of the equation, and that's where inclusion comes in too. We want different people whose voices are included so that they can tell you like, hey, this is different. A lot of hospitals in major areas like Boston and Chicago and LA have discovered that, I mean, some of the health outcomes are due to people living in food deserts, right? They don't actually have access to food. So of course, certain pathways of high blood pressure and diabetes follow that. But if all the research is done on people who have access to really good food,
you're going to miss out.
You're not going to have, it's just not smart. Like it has nothing to do with social justice. It's just not smart. I think the medical profession is learning that in some ways, but early in the learning journey, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds, you've mentioned a few points about the importance of a diverse workforce. You mentioned you want the doctors to look like the patients. And I think they've done studies that patient satisfaction and adherence is much higher if they feel like they have some similarities or can relate with their doctors. And then also from the top perspective is making sure that you have diverse voices being heard that may have different thoughts or ways of approaching problems so that you can get a more wholesome understanding of what's going on in the real world.
Absolutely. And I think those two are closely linked in that if I share similarities with someone and they're explaining something to me, something that can't be tested, right? Like pain, like in rheumatology, you deal a lot with pain.
Oh, yes.
Pain can't be tested. So the same amount of pain, one person might say, oh my God, like I can't take it. I can't go to work. I can't do anything. And that exact same, I guess, quantity of pain for someone else is like, I'm fine. Everything is fine. Right. And so I've noticed, like just in my life, that women of color, especially women of color who are from immigrant backgrounds, like will refuse to say they're in pain. I don't care how much pain they're in. Like they could literally be bleeding and they're like, everything is fine, right? They don't talk about pain in the same way. And so if you have a similarity, you might also have a similarity of experience where you're going to ask follow-up questions that lead to better health outcomes, right? And so you might say, okay, are you in pain and you're just putting up with it? Or are you not in pain? Are you in pain and you just don't want to say you're in pain? Or is there actually an absence of pain, as opposed to looking at those like faces and saying, just tell me like which face like looks like your pain, right? If somebody were to say to me, does that hurt? My answer is almost always no, right? But if they say, is there an absence of pain? I would say, well,
That's so
there's a
interesting.
presence of pain, but I'm tolerating it.
Yeah.
And so the similarities, I think, lead to better questioning, and they also lead to sharper discovery of facts, which then leads you to better outcomes. So it's not just that the patient feels comfortable, it's that the doctor is asking better questions because they're recognizing some of those subjectivities that the patient may be expressing.
I see that a lot myself when I treat especially Latina women. So I speak Spanish and I'm originally from Venezuela. When I get referred Latin women to my clinic, they often have a lot of complaints, and sometimes what they're complaining is lost in translation, right? That there may not be words in English to describe what the patient is feeling. And it's so helpful to sort of speak the language and being able to understand what they're experiencing so that you can better figure out what's going on and drive the appropriate treatments.
It's funny because both my parents were physicians, right? My mom is retired. My father's passed away. And I remember when I was young, we're first generation immigrants. I came here as a teenager. I remember when I was in high school and it was like, if I said I didn't feel well, it's like, can you stand? Are you bleeding? Go to school. Like, that was the diagnosis, right? Like, if you can stand up and you're not bleeding, go to school. We'll figure it out later. And it was, so I have that same, and sometimes it can come across as a lack of empathy towards other people. When they say they don't feel good, I'm like, you're standing and you're not bleeding. So,
tough it out, go to work,
exactly,
go to school.
Right? Of course that wasn't healthy. Like, of course there were times when, especially because I suffer from migraines, there were times when things needed to be paid attention to. But it wasn't that my parents weren't trying to be good parents. But I have to be very conscious of, because that is how I grew up, I am so likely to call somebody whiny when they say they're in pain, because my standard of how much pain you should be in before you suggest that you're in pain is not normal. And
That's
it's
so
not
interesting.
healthy, right? But it's not that I'm trying to discount someone's pain, but once I become conscious of it, then what happens, the way you interrupt the bias, is I'm conscious of it. So now I say, okay, somebody just said they're in pain. And the thought that went through your head is they're standing and they're not bleeding. Okay, that's not the only definition of pain, right? But now I can say that in my brain really quickly and I can say, what's wrong? How can I help? And so your behavior, your thoughts are automatic, but your behavior doesn't have to be. And so the interruption of implicit bias is understanding those thoughts and saying, but I can choose behavior that is different than my initial thought.
In rheumatology in specific, for instance, there are studies that show that Blacks receive biologic medications less frequently than whites, right? And I'm pretty sure there's something about an implicit bias. You mentioned before, is my patient going to take the medicine the way I want them to? Or maybe their symptoms are not severe enough to warrant biologics, right? Maybe they're not in really that much pain, and let's just try this other way of approaching them.
And there's a lot of research in implicit bias of kind of like facial expressions and micro expressions and macro expressions too. Depending on how you grew up, like there's a stoicism around pain versus like a more dramatic expression of pain. And the stoicism, it's not that the doctor is saying they don't believe you, but you may say the pain is intense, but if you're saying it in this really stoic way, the doctor is hearing it's not that bad for them to deal with, right? But if you're used to expressing pain in a way that's like, oh my God, it hurts. Like the doctors, because only like 20% of our communication, especially when we're in person, is verbal, right? We're looking at all this other stuff of micro expressions and things like that. And so it Stoicism can sometimes be read as a lack of pain, but it's a higher tolerance. It's a different expression. So, yeah, I mean, like even Black and Latinx children who are asthmatic get asthma medications in hospitals, I think like an hour and a half after white children do.
Oh
Like,
my goodness.
and that can lead to fatalities. And,
Wow.
but it's this, what is going on there? Like, what is it about someone saying I can't breathe or a parent saying my child can't breathe that causes that? And I've known too many doctors in my life. Doctors don't have it in them to be explicitly biased when they are dealing with medical decisions, right? Like it's rare if somebody's just over there.
Yep.
But doctors are also taught, especially if you're in an ER, you're a trauma surgeon or dealing with trauma or just busy, to come to conclusions very quickly. You're not always taught to second guess your initial conclusion. And I think where bias comes in for doctors isn't explicit, but it is an implicit bias that the first decision that you came to is correct.
Got it.
And if you don't have a way of second guessing yourself deliberately, like not second guessing like a doubt, but like actually saying, what did I hear that led me to that conclusion? Did I hear anything else that could lead me to a different conclusion? If you're not actively and critically examining those conclusions that you've arrived at, you get to very different places, right? And that's where I think the disparities show up. I think if doctors had more time, if they weren't as busy, I think you would see them think more. But I'm sure you see this in your clinical practice too, like the speed with which you have to see people make decisions and move to the next one. Well, you're relying on unconscious associations.
100%.
You don't have time to do it,
Yeah.
right?
Sometimes even as the patient is being taken to the room, and this happened to me yesterday, I saw them and it's like, I know what you have.
Yeah.
I think I was right. But you're absolutely right that we make those snap judgments even without thinking about it. And as you said, this may lead us to misinterpret a patient's pain or not fully understand what they're going through because we make assumptions about, oh, if they were really in pain, then they should be writhing on the bed. And they're not. So therefore, they're not really in pain.
And I want to just make a little point here that I think is really important, especially like in medical and law enforcement, et cetera. And that is, you do get to have instincts, right? And this is something called thin slicing, where after you've seen something multiple times, you should come to a conclusion faster than somebody who's seen it the first time. And that is what experience does. And that is legitimate and it is helpful. And the heuristical sort of component of that is really important. But you have to get better at saying, is that an instinct? Or could I have overlooked something because I got to the conclusion too soon? You shouldn't wholesale get rid of instincts because they're really important, which is why you want to see somebody who's had more experience because they've seen it so many times, right? At the same time, you want somebody who has experience, who's seen it many times, who can thin slice their way to a faster decision, but who has just enough awareness to question themselves, to double check their conclusion. So we want to add that layer of double checking, not second guessing at the very beginning. Because doctors do develop heuristics and you want them to, right? Like otherwise we're basically negating the point of experience. We don't want to do that. We just want to remind people that experience could be accurate. It may not be accurate. And if you're not asking yourself the question, you're vulnerable to making decisions that could be inaccurate.
I think Donnie Kahneman talks about this like system 1 and system 2, right? The system 1 is sort of those quick. I was like, I know when I saw that patient yesterday, I know what you have. And you're right, that's been incredibly helpful because most of the time those heuristics are correct. That's why they become heuristics. But I guess your point is we should always have system 2 playing in the background saying it's like, okay, I thought from the first time I saw this patient that they had this. is that correct? Could this be anything else? What am I missing? What snap judgments did I make? Did I make that because they were white or black or female or male? Like you said, that extra time to question those assumptions that you made initially.
And don't get nervous about the time involved because you can habituate it, right? Like when you do it constantly, like it doesn't take a lot of time. One thing that's really helpful that I practice all the time with everything that I do is don't discount aberrations and don't discount the exceptions, right? If you just train your brain to focus on the exception and focus on the aberration and say, because when we, especially as researchers, as clinicians, as many of your listeners might be, when you see aberrations, you quickly sort of compartmentalize it as not relevant to the decision making. And after you reach your conclusion, go get all those aberrations and say, if the aberration was actually a symptom, if I put this back in here, would that change it? And one of the ways that implicit associations work is we quickly screen out things that we don't think are important. And that's a place where you can catch yourself. What did you screen out? Because that is where some of your most important bias interrupters could be.
That's so interesting. I mean, in rheumatology, we are sort of the Sherlock Holmes of medicine, where we often get these patients with a variety of weird symptoms and we try to put them into buckets. And you're absolutely right. I've caught myself saying it's like, well, let's just take the things that fit in the bucket and ignore everything else. And I guess what you're suggesting is like, yes, it's good, put them in the bucket, but also take a look at the stuff that you left out and see whether that might put back in and how that may change your final diagnosis.
If you take something out and you say, well, what if I decided that couldn't be taken out? Like if I put this back in, does it change? And I do think rheumatology has some particular issues around that because you have a lot of diagnoses that are by process of elimination, right? And that leads to like, you can discount certain things objectively, but then you're left with a bunch of subjective stuff where you're like, I think this is it, right? And especially with certain autoimmune diseases, and especially, we just have no idea how much of a role stress plays. We don't fully know how much of a role hormones play. And so sometimes it's just that thought exercise of, if I decide this can't come out of the bucket, would I look at this differently? And you just become a more creative critical thinking where you're playing some games in your mind and you say, what if I had to do it this way, right? Like when you hire people, for example, one of the things that I recommend is, let's say you love a candidate, absolutely love them. Well, your brain is doing the same thing. What it did is it screened out all of the things that you didn't like so that you could love them this much. So in that situation, the exercise would be, go to what you've said isn't important about the candidate and take one of those things and say, what if I had to make an argument that this is the worst candidate ever to hire? Do I have any data to back that up, right? If somebody came to me and said, whatever happens, you cannot hire this person, have I heard anything? Have I seen anything that would allow me to justify that? Because then your brain, this is confirmation bias kind of using it deliberately. You're then going to go look for data that justifies that conclusion. So you're going to find the data that justifies that conclusion. But if you don't look for it, and the first impression was, I love this person, you're just going to screen out everything. All those like danger signs, you're just going to screen them out because and we do it with our personal relationships as well. And I do this with my friends sometimes. I have a friend who's in the dating arena. And I'm like, so did you see anything that would indicate that this person is a serial killer? She jokes, but she says now, or I'll say, do you have anything that indicates that they're an armed robber? Like, I just ask these like random questions. Now she says when she's at dinner, even if she really likes a guy, her mind is constantly on alert for, do I see serial killer tendencies? Do I see armed robber tendencies? Because she knows I'm going to ask her that later,
That's
right?
awesome.
but she's caught some things where she's like, that's a weird thing that person
Oh,
was
that's
doing.
interesting.
And as she paid attention to it, she was like, I'm really glad that I saw that because it allowed me to not get taken advantage of. Yeah, so you can use it in lots of places.
I think that's great. And the idea, the way I sort of see that is sort of seeing things from a different perspective, right? Like
Exactly.
I'm now in the perspective that this is the best candidate. It's like, well, okay, how would somebody think if they thought that this was actually the worst candidate? And then you'd
Exactly.
be like, well, actually, his shoes were kind of funny and
Yeah,
he speaks with an accent. And you may pick up all these things by imagining you were somebody else sort of making that evaluation and that decision.
absolutely. And it's like if somebody, your first instinct was, I don't like this person. If you had to go back and say, okay, I don't want to hire this person, but okay, what if I had to make a decision to hire this person? And suddenly you're like, all right, well, they were top of their class. Okay, fine. They have this experience. Okay, fine. They have this. And you're like, and by the time you're done, you're like, okay, well, maybe I don't hate him as much as I thought I did. Right.
Yeah.
And so maybe I didn't love him as much as I thought I did. So you're just, again, implicit bias isn't bad. It's not prejudice. It's not discrimination. It is these assumptions that we make, these associations that we have. And what we want to do is become more critical consumers of our own thoughts and understand that your thoughts and your behaviors don't have to correlate sometimes.
Oh, interesting.
You might have thoughts that are leading you to some rapid judgments, but your behavior can be, you can still take your time. You can still ask more questions. Like you don't have to go with that rapid judgment. And I think if more people can do this, whether it's in research, clinics, anywhere, I think that intention of wanting to be inclusive can just become more real, right? Because nothing we talked about today deals with the explicit folks. Those people we just need to call the police on and do stuff with. This is the implicit stuff.
Yeah. The last thing I want to touch on is what you just mentioned is the research arena. So you've made some comments about clinical trials that maybe there weren't enough women. In rheumatology, we've certainly had similar issues. So we know, for instance, that lupus most commonly affects minorities, and yet many clinical trials in lupus, or even how we define what lupus is made from a cohort of like mostly white people. And like you said, it may lead you to make the wrong assumptions. As a researcher, where does implicit bias play a role? Do you think it's playing a role in saying, well, that person is a Latina, so I'm not going to even ask her to enroll in the trial? Like, where do you see the implicit bias may prevent us from recruiting a pretty diverse patient cohort?
I mean, I think one, we have to acknowledge the history of medical research in this country and that there are groups of people, especially African Americans and Latinx people and some Asians as well, where they've been experimented on, right? And the stories are in the communities of you can't trust these trials because you don't know what they're going to do to you. So there's bias in the communities of whether or not you're trustworthy. And to the point that you brought up earlier, the only way to make it attractive to people who are in communities that have been traumatized by all kinds of unethical and illegal research is there's got to be people on your team that can communicate with those communities, that they can trust. And it doesn't always have to be the lead researcher or the physician. Look at the totality of your research team. Can you get interns on there? Can you get people who are social workers or people who are psychologists on your team for the purpose of creating a diverse subject pool? Because you need people to go into communities and convince people to trust you. And if you're an all-white male research team, I don't care how much you go after Latinas or African-American women, they're not going to trust you. It's the decision to say, we need a diverse population and not just tokenized diversity, but like enough diversity where then you don't just make what happens to those people exceptions and you just say, well, we didn't have enough of a population to talk about that particular symptom. You need enough of the sample in order to be able to talk about statistical significance. But then you also need people on the team and think really broadly about what a team looks like, who can be the liaisons with certain communities. Because even if you want people in the research pools, like the history of medical research in this country is not one that is pleasant for a lot of communities of color in this
Yeah,
country.
absolutely. That brings us back to sort of a diverse workforce as well. So we've discussed implicit bias, how it might affect who you hire. It might affect you as a clinician when you're making clinical decisions. It might affect your decisions as a researcher to recruit people in trials. So there's all these ways in which implicit bias may be negatively affecting what we do in healthcare. So what can we do about it?
I think this is a good first step. It's just awareness. The awareness has to be really non-judgmental. We can't approach this from the perspective of it's bad, we got to stop it right now. Like it's bad and we got to do it. Like, because you're going to trigger defensiveness. And I oftentimes think that people have that approach of it's bad, we got to do something about it when they haven't thought about it, when there isn't like a deeper intellectual and like even just a scholar background on it where you can have a discussion on it, right? So I think that's one thing. The second is really differentiating between those associations which are natural and not really negotiable in our heads, right? Like they're going to be there. A differentiation between bias and behavior. And we can be much more thoughtful about, for example, Atul Gawande's book on checklists, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like checklists are a way to get out of our heads and get out of. So using checklists, for example, so when the NIH says these are the characteristics of a research team that we will fund, and one of them is racial ethnic background, another is thoughtfulness about your research subjects. It's those kinds of checklists of don't forget this, like think about this, is they're really helpful because so when doctors have checklists of what are all the questions you ask patients, ask those questions. Like otherwise, you're only going to ask the questions that you already think you know the answers to. But if you have a list in front of you, every single time, like something's going to surprise you because you followed that checklist. I think that's really helpful from an awareness perspective. I also think that it has to be connected to excellence in practice and not a social good.
Tell me more about that.
I think a lot of times when people talk about diversity, it's like we should be doing the right thing. Like we need to hire Black people because, you know, we should be doing the right thing. No, when we think about it as like we're doing something that is so altruistic, like we're trying to correct a societal wrong, that's when we don't see it as related to us, right? But earlier when I was saying like, you're not as smart if you don't have those different perspectives.
Got
like,
it.
You're not going to be as good of a doctor because the outcomes for your patients are dependent on you getting diverse perspectives, right? So if you push it as medical excellence and practice excellence, then it can become embedded into practice protocols and practice guidelines.
Yeah.
As opposed to this like social good thing that sits over here where people are like, I'm liberal, I believe in this, and so I'm going to go do it. Like it has nothing to do with politics. It has nothing to do with your political thing. It's you're not as smart.
So you're saying like for an organization, a hospital or a healthcare system, it's not we need to hire a diverse workforce because we want to make sure that everybody has good opportunities. Is like we want to be the best hospital or healthcare system out there. And in order to do that, we need to hire a diverse workforce because they will enrich understanding of disease and allow us to better take care of patients.
Absolutely. Especially hospitals are watching their bottom line these days too, right? I have a thyroid condition. I absolutely look at hospital websites. And if you don't have a female endocrinologist, I'm not coming. Right?
Oh, so interesting.
I think there's a lot more women and people of color, especially with the amount of information that's available to us, that are making more informed consumer choices. And as healthcare is becoming more of like competitive in the marketplace, it's yeah, there's hospitals I won't step foot in because I look at their senior leadership. I'm like, all white men, I'm not interested. I don't think you're even going to understand what I'm saying. I think you have that. I also think that you have a lot more people now who are aware of these issues and are using their dollars and their decision making power to force these decisions too, right? And they're saying, like, I'm sorry, you cannot have an entire OBGYN team that is all men. Suddenly, like, their business isn't sustainable, and the female practice or the practice with women down the road is like you have to wait 8 months to get an appointment
Wow.
because, and if hospitals and especially practices really started looking and saying, could this be affecting us economically as well?
So interesting.
Yes, you will see that it is. So a lot of different reasons to care, whatever floats your boat, right? But the important thing is the understanding the associations allows you to make better decisions about your behavior. Your associations are not your behavior, and your behavior are not your associations. And that helps us just choose behaviors that are inclusive, even if our initial thoughts weren't.
Arin, I think this is a great place to end. I really appreciate your time. You've been so insightful about implicit, explicit bias, how it plays a role in healthcare and what we should do about it. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. My pleasure. It was wonderful talking with you.
Thank you all for listening, downloading, rating, and subscribing to our ACR On Air podcast. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter at ACR Room. I hope this episode has provided you with some tools for recognizing your implicit biases and strategies to ensure that your behavior is not a result of unconscious thought. As always, please stay healthy.